Hello and welcome to part 3 of this mod making series. The first thing I wanted to address was a comment from the user, the zoned oystander, and they said, "Interesting. I always assumed all modders were skilled programmers. Didn't know many could simply borrow code and repurpose it or ask for code on forums. This actually makes mod creation seem somewhat easy. Obviously, there is more to this than this video shows, but it's still pretty inspiring. Looking forward to checking out this mod. I'll probably start a treasure hunter type character with it." Thank you for that comment. Nice to see, nice to read. It's always nice to see comments that are positive and stuff like that. But it was not something I expected to really see this early on in the series, I guess, or at all almost. It was like, hey, somebody, the fact that so far somebody through watching that I was able to somewhat dispel the illusion that I think all professions, and especially something such as not profession, skills, whatever, something such as programming or coding, whatever, it has this sort of mysticism or veil of like the man behind the curtain kind of feel to it or something. Like people look at it and they're just like, oh, that is so foreign and alien, and that's not something that I could possibly do or consider doing. That needs to be only done by a professional or some crap like that, a professional, skilled somebody, blah blah blah. And I was always never, after I realized so many things working in certain industries, and in my case, not even related programming or coding for the most part, of stuff like factory maintenance or factory machinery, warehouse machinery, whatever you want to say, robotics, certain things like that, which, has dabbles in programming, obviously, that kind of stuff. But people look at it and it's like, oh, this thing is so scary and foreign and complex that there's no way that I could figure it out. But being able to sort of dispel that somewhat, I think, is a very good thing, and definitely one of those many side goals I have with this kind of series I'm doing, in this case in general. So I'm glad to see that can be seen by somebody even in the second part of this little series so far. That is very good, and thank you very much for that nice comment. But anyway, besides that, one thing that I was doing that I realized last night when I was just lying in my bed, I was, as probably many people often do, they just lie in their bed before they actually fall asleep into unconsciousness. They think about stuff, likely stuff that they did in the day just before they went to bed. And in this case, I was thinking about, okay, what am I going to do next with this mod? What is the next steps I'm going to take, what that I need to do, that I want to work on to progress, that I will do, tomorrow or whatever, the next time I make a video on this. And then it made me think, I was like, you know what, this is a important topic to, I think, mention. It's kind of similar to that problem-solving mentality that I went over in the last video in the middle, where how I think about a problem or how I think of something and how to make a solution for it or do a solution, whatever. And it was something that I learned sort of when I was like in high school, I believe. One thing that the teacher did bring up that was a pretty useful thing that I definitely think should be brought up more, or is a very handy information, is I believe the term would be something called recursion. And as far as I know, the definition of it, or whatever, the idea of this being, recursion is when, or doing recursion, whatever, is when you take a task or take something that is bigger and then breaking it up into smaller bite-sized pieces. Like, let's say, taking an image, just in the concept here, taking an image, and then instead of an image of like a sunset, you would break that up into smaller things. Like you'd instead take out everything else besides the grass, or maybe the sun itself, or the sky, whatever, other little features. And then with those broken down pieces, you could even break those down even further, potentially, into like its bare minimum parts, like the pixels, like, the colors of each pixel of like yellow and orange for the sun and green and something of the grass. Taking a big thing and breaking it down into smaller things. And what you do with this is you make a task more digestible in this process. The teacher gave a pretty good example and that we did over that, which was pretty useful. And he was basically saying, for imagine if you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and describe what you would do to make that a thing, to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And as somebody who, you probably know how to make a sandwich, how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, the process of it, you would be thinking, all right, well, the entire end result you want to do for making that peanut butter and jelly sandwich is obviously to have a made peanut butter and jelly sandwich. That's the result. That's the desired result of the end of the task. But if you look at that by itself, one might be almost intimidated to say, like, oh man, how do you get to that end result there? So what you do, you'd think how you do it and break down each thing that you'd kind of do. And in this case, you'd probably say, okay, well, I have to get up out of my chair, or I have to do whatever I start from, go to wherever the supplies for the peanut butter and jelly sandwich are, like the kitchen, probably. So you'd say, all right, get up out of my bed, or get up out of my chair, go downstairs, go to the kitchen, find the peanut butter, find the jelly, find a knife or some kind of utensil, find bread, find a plate or something, and then put those all together on a table or a counter, and then start assembling it. Take the peanut butter, spread it on the bread on one side, and then take out the jelly, spread it on one side. Do whatever you do, put the two halves together, and then there you have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And then he said, well, that would be a recursion in that sense, but when you are doing something like training or telling a robot or a program, which a robot is just reading from a program, from a script, whatever, what you tell it to do basically exactly, and you'd have to break those tasks down even more to their sub-task parts. You wouldn't, to a human, you would just tell them, like, unscrew the cap of the peanut butter jar and then put the knife in there, you'd think you wouldn't have to describe this, but this is how you kind of do it as a human, like tell them to do these things, and then take the knife, stick it in the jar, get a little bit of peanut butter on there, and then spread that peanut butter onto the bread. That's how you describe it. But to a robot or to a program, how you do it, you would have to, like, every little tiny task, you would have to describe it almost exactly to some extent. Like, to unscrew the cap, you would be telling it to, like, move this arm or move this piece this many degrees at this coordinates, like to the Z coordinate, you'd move it like 45 degrees this way, and then move the arm 15 degrees in the Y axis or the X axis, whatever. And then tell the arm to then move in the Y axis to put the thing in the knife in the peanut butter, and then move the arm around in a few different degrees, spin around, whatever. Like all these little tiny, super tiny little tasks. That's how you'd break it down for a computer. And the idea is that each little tiny thing, if you think about it like that, that's the difficult part, is to think about the whole process as a whole and build it up into a whole. But each little individual task itself, such as moving the arm 15 degrees in the Y-axis, that is a simple task in itself that is being built up in a sequence to make a more complex task happen, something more useful happen. That's the idea of recursion, is to take each individual tiny task there, break it down, and then it makes it easier because then each little individual thing is an easier task in itself. So instead of thinking like, okay, how am I going to make the robot spread peanut butter onto the bread? You would instead break that whole thing down and say, okay, well, right now on this line, I'm going to make the arm move in the Y direction 15 degrees, and then in the X direction 20 degrees, and then down like 2 units of distance or something, like whatever. That's the idea. I probably did not do a great way of explaining this. It probably made it sound more complex than it really is. But that's the idea, is to take complex tasks and then break them down into smaller, more digestible, and easier to understand tasks, which will eventually, in a sequence, become a full thing, like a full action, a full process of making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, a full process of doing something in a mod or making the whole mod itself can be broken down into smaller things. And that's what I did in my mind last night when I was thinking a little bit. Or at least part of it. I was thinking, okay, so what do I have to do next now that I have this add loot chest on transition dungeon interior? What do I have to do next? Well, I thought, okay, first the thing that I'm going to do, probably, but I might skip it for now because I could do it later. That's the beautiful thing about it, is that it's a sequence. You could do parts of the end of the sequence or in the middle of the sequence, and then add on stuff from the more earlier in the sequence as you need them. So I don't have to do all the tasks at the exact, like, from beginning to end. I could do it from end to beginning if I want. So in this case, I'm not going to do the beginning parts. I'm just going to do maybe parts at the end, and then I could just incorporate them on later. What I would first do, at least just to get the idea out there, what I would first do here is I'd want to make sure that I'd want to check to make sure on this on transition interior thing that certain things that I want to do are first possible, or they're first, like, I'll check certain things first, such as if I want to check what kind of dungeon type happens, like maybe if I want chests to only spawn in certain dungeon types but not others, or maybe make them more frequently have a higher chance of spawning in certain dungeon types than others. I would just have to check the type of dungeon itself and then go through all of them, basically just go through all of them and then say, okay, if it's this one, do this. If it's not that one, don't do this. If it is this one, do this. If it is, like, change certain little variables and parameters and values based on that as I go through this checking process. And then this would be the same idea that I would be going on to for what I would actually have to do within each of those things after checking it. Like, this is one of those incremental small tasks that I would have to do, would be, okay, when I first transition into the dungeon, I want to make sure that before my on transition dungeon interior thing here triggers, I'm almost 100% sure that by that point, all of the loot piles have already been created in the dungeon. They've already gone through that process. So I now, if I want to replace those loot piles or do something with them, check them, I can, because they're already there. But then with that, I can make a list, or get a list, retrieve a list of all of those loot piles in the dungeon, and then I can do something with that, such as checking if it is a certain type of loot pile, like say if it was a loot pile that was created because the player dropped items there, and then I could maybe ignore those in that case. Or if it's a loot pile that was created from the random generated loot pile markers that the dungeon normally would do, and say, okay, I want to use this one, and then I want to roll a dice based on something or whatever, roll some value to determine if that should be replaced with a chest, or if that should be left alone, or something else should change. Maybe the loot inside of it should change in some way or be added or something. And I would have to do that by retrieving all of these objects and making a list out of it, which I know how to do, even though it seems like a complex thing at first. But once you do it at least once, it makes a lot more sense, which I will be showing that. And then there's way more things that I have to, break down the task and think of doing. But I think maybe just to make it simpler in my head, maybe I'll just start with the kind of beginning stuff that I would check, even though I don't have all of the details sussed out in my planning or my mind here. I don't have all the details sussed out of exactly what I'm gonna do here. Like, the first thing I know I want to check is some of the aspects of the dungeon type that is being transitioned into. I want to check what type it is and probably change certain things based on that. But the details aren't sussed out, such as what values will be used exactly, which dungeon types will be different based on that. So I'm just going to start with, to get started there, is basically just check one dungeon type and say, like, okay, this dungeon type will only be the one that this task will happen, just to get a base framework to look at. Then I'll say, okay, how will I do that? So the way I will do that is by, as I've said I normally do, I will look back, I will think of what other things I've already done that task before I've used the sim before. And in this case, I haven't specifically done it for dungeons, but I have done it for interiors of like building types, such for this mod that I've used already, arena style flavor text recoded. So I'll just look and I'll see down on this method that I copied from, the show flavor text on transition dungeon interior. Now this one that gets this variable that gets defined here, that gets used later in this method to check some other thing, some other aspect. But I don't care about weather type right now. Yeah, I shouldn't. I'm probably never going to care about weather type for this particular chest spawning thing. So weather type, I can ignore that. Same thing with the season. Location data, that might be one that I do want, but it also might not be. But I'm going to take it anyway, because that seems like something that would be useful. Just in case maybe it's not going to be a dungeon always. Maybe I'm going to also do for buildings that certain things will be changed to chest or something like that. I don't know. So, and location data can be useful. So I'll take this df location type is what it would be called. Is not defined yet. So what I'll do, at least to Tandy in Visual Studio, is that I'll go over it. I'll say show potential fixes, and then it'll usually say I could either have this added, this like kind of reference to what that's referring to, but instead I'll just do using, and then it'll add this line to that using stuff that I mentioned, and then that will allow that to know what definition basically to use, and then it won't have an error anymore. It'll know what to use and where that type is coming from, essentially. So I got that defined, even if I don't need it right now. Current time in seconds, I don't need that. Tokens, that would be for like text tokens, which for right now I don't need that. And for this if statement, this check, this first one, I don't think I necessarily need it, because it's probably a given if I'm transitioning into a dungeon that the player will be inside at that point, but just for the sake of it, I will have that check, because you never know, weird stuff happens, so it's useful to have that kind of thing. So we'll copy and paste that if statement, add some curly brackets to enclose it, and I will have to do something similar for this player enter exit that I just did with the location data. So this player enter exit is being defined here. So instead, I could just kind of do this. And then that will do the same thing, essentially. It's a little less concise, and I'll probably change that to clean it up later. But for right now, for example purposes, for simplicity's sake, I'll just do that. So if all that crap, player enter exit, is player inside, it returns a value of true, the true and false. It returns a value of true when the player is inside any structure, which, while you are transitioning into the interior, also counts. The interior also including a dungeon interior, like any place where, this is where it becomes more specific to the actual game you're working on. And in this case, in Daggerfall's case, Daggerfall Unity's case, when you are inside of a building, such as like a shop or a house, that's considered inside a building, inside an interior. When you're inside a dungeon, that's considered inside an interior. So yeah, that's what we'd hope for. While we're transitioning, it'll check true if the player is inside, because they should be inside of a dungeon, and then it'll go allow this to check correctly or check true, and then let it go into here, which will do more stuff. Which we will then continue where we were from before, and then see some of this other stuff. This stuff is, once again, another if statement. I use if statements a lot, and some people use them way less than I do, and some people use them way more. They just make more sense to me. I like to do my logic process that way, generally, if possible. Even though it's sometimes it could be less efficient, it usually just works for me. It makes sense to me. Reading here is player inside open shop. So we don't want that one because we don't care if they're in a shop. That's not the part that we care about. Inside a tavern, we don't care about that one either. So we're going to keep going down until we find the one that we want. Inside building type, temple, no, we don't care. Building discovery, data, guild hall, faction, mages guild, nope, we don't care. Same thing, palace, nope, we don't care. Oh, I think I was actually looking at the wrong one. Whoops. Well, it's basically the same thing. Yeah, it was. So, on transition dungeon interior. So, in this case, for this mod, for this other mod, I had to do on transition dungeon interior to check if the player entered into one of the castles of one of the three major uh, story cities of Daggerfall, that being Daggerfall Palace or Daggerfall whatever castle, Wayrest, and Sentinel palaces. And they are not considered normal buildings, they're actually considered dungeons, technically, the way that they work. So that's why I had to do that. Now let's see if with that I did something useful for this purpose. I think I did. So we got Sentinel, Wayrest, and there might be another one that I did at the end. Possibly. No, not. Unfortunately, no. So I might actually, because I remember I did something like this. So I will look for another mod, which would be potentially better quality, because better quality descriptions and arena style flavor text there are so similar to one another. It like felt like so much of a copy and paste thing. In this case, even more so than other cases. So I'm gonna open up the main to that one, and we'll see if I have something more for that. On transition interior. So does not seem like I do for dungeons. Yeah. So I'm gonna have to find that somewhere else. Or I'm just gonna have to think to myself and remember, having the knowledge of the code base somewhat, how to actually do this specifically. So I'm gonna give one more mod a look that I've made that might shed a little bit of light on this. So random starting dungeon, it might have something useful in this case. So I'm just gonna look up, like, do search, control F, search for a term. Let's say, dungeon's gonna be mentioned like a million times, so I'm just gonna try and see if I could find anything worth looking at. Worth looking at to basically find the dungeon type uh, of a dungeon or location, whatever, and then check that, and then check that value, essentially. And in the worst case, I will just have to figure it out myself in terms of like what a dungeon type is and then looking at it that way, such as down here, as it looks like it's going to have to be the case. So I have this method of the location type, and location type is location type, and then it equals location types, dungeon keep, dungeon room. That's actually a different kind of dungeon type that I'm looking for. These are the ones I'm looking for. DF region dot dungeon types dot whatever, cemetery, scorpion nest, volcanic caverns, dragon's den, barbarian stronghold, yada yada yada. So I can get this value by looking at where I'm finding this. So is dungeon type, I will say find all references. And then it should bring me to the one where it is being called from. And in this case, it is right here. So is dungeon type, and then the thing that it's giving it is region data dot map table, I being the in this loop, basically, where it's or not in this loop, in this list is giving this I value, which is inside of some kind of loop here, this for loop. And each time that it's just a value that's going up as the loop continues, as it goes on. Like each time it does a full revolution of this loop, the I goes up by 1. So whatever, it's just going through like potentially hundreds or thousands of these locations. So this I could equal 0, or it could equal 1,000, or it could equal 256 or 5 million. I don't know. It could equal anything. But it's saying region data, map table, I, that value, dot dungeon type. So I'm going to have to find region data. I mean, not always this will be the case, but in this case, this is what I'm just trying to look for so I could find it where I've done this before. So region data, where's that coming from? That's being defined here. So then I'll go back even further. Collect dungeon indices of type. And then this region info is that region data. So where is region info coming? It's coming from up here. So this looks like it would be the originator. So DF region, region info, new DF region. But then region, because that's like a empty, it's empty at that point. So I need to see where it's getting defined, which it looks like it's being defined down here. Region info equals Daggerfall Unity dot instance dot content reader dot map file reader get region, and then you have to give it a value. So get region would be the region that you are currently located in. That's this case with random starting dungeon, it's different because it's actually going through every region in the game, not just the one you're currently located in. So I'm gonna have to do like a combination here. I'm gonna have to find out, okay, so now I know how to get this dungeon type, but now I also have to get I have to figure out the way to get the region that the player is currently located in. Or maybe the region that this dungeon, whichever one. Either I can get to where the player is located and where the dungeon is located. Either one. I'd prefer player, because that's usually easier. You can usually assume that's what the context you're trying to pull from is where the player currently is. So I can find that with, since I have the knowledge of foresight that I've looked through this stuff already, kind of, is player GPS. And look at that, it's the same thing, kind of current location. So I could actually probably use that same thing to find the region that the player is in. So location data might actually be enough in this case. So I'll start a new if statement here. If, and then I'll just make it so that's enclosed and stuff. So we'll do location data dot, and then see what is in this. See what there is in here. Map table data. Region index, region name. So there is definitely region info in here, and possibly the map table data, location index, dungeon. Let's see maybe dungeon has dungeon type in it. It might. Ah, it doesn't. That's more specific things than that. So let's try map table data. Let's see what map table data might have in it. Dungeon type. There we go. That might be the one we're looking for. Dungeon type. See if we could do another. So let's see if we can find where dungeon type is coming from in this case. So it's coming from DF region and then dungeon types. So that is the dungeon types we are looking for. These kind of dungeon types. So this should probably work for what we want to check. But it has an error, so cannot implicitly convert type to bool. Okay, so that the reason that is that the type is not a true or false value, but we can make it a true or false value by doing equals equals, which is basically a check or a logical operation kind of thing. Like it's telling that equals equals, say 0 or something like that. We say equals equals like if this dungeon type equals 0, then it is true. And if it doesn't equal 0, then it's false. That's what equals equals means. It's checking one side with the other, and then seeing if they are both equal to each other. And if it isn't, then it's false. If it is, it's true. So now we just have to give it a, thankfully this is helpful, equals equals, and then it'll give us a recommendation, which would be df region dot dungeon types, then dot again, and then it'll give us the whole list of the actual dungeon types that there are. This quote unquote enum value, which is basically just a list, kind of like telling you what there are. These are very useful, these enums. They get used a lot, especially for stuff like this, but these are all the possible dungeon types within Daggerfall: Crypt, Orc Stronghold, Human Stronghold, Prison, Mine, Natural Cave, Coven, Vampire Haunt, and then even at the bottom is no dungeon, so they're technically, you know, like an error or something, no dungeon type specified, Cemetery, Scorpion Nest, all that stuff. So now we can pick whatever one we want. I don't know. Let's go with Cemetery. Cemeteries are those dungeons that you see automatically on the map. The red dots that show up, not the orange ones that they're not all, funny enough, they're not all automatically discovered, but most of them are. There's actually some that are technically hidden, which is interesting. But these are those small dungeons that you could find without having to have discovered them first, unlike Cemetery or Crypts, which would be the actual dungeon itself that needs to be discovered first. But anyway, we'll say that if location data, which in this case, location data is in the context of where the player currently is, game manager instance player GPS current location. So then location data is checking this whatever values, doesn't really matter, map table, all this crap to find what the dungeon type is for the dungeon in the location the player currently is. Yeah, and we're checking if it will be equal to a cemetery. So if it's a cemetery, then it's true, and it'll continue here. If it is not a cemetery, some other dungeon type, it'll not run any of this, and then it'll go on to the next, whatever it needs to do. So now we have it checking on transition dungeon interior. If the player is inside, which they should be, this is not really that needed, but it's there anyway. The player is inside, which it should be true. Then it'll go on to here, and then it'll check right after if the dungeon that the player is transitioning to, or the location that they're transitioning to, if the dungeon type is defined as a cemetery. And if it is, it does whatever stuff we're gonna start next. And if it's not, it'll continue on to do something else. But I think this video has gone on long enough for this specific thing. So I think I'm actually going to end it here. Even though I still haven't gotten that much done. But I've went through some pretty important steps here. So we have in this case, we have a dungeon type that we're going to check for. To see if we should do whatever things we're going to do next. And we know what the location of the location data that the player currently is, to use those values from that location data to check more things and to break down more stuff, to check certain things and say, like, okay, do this if this is true, don't do this if that is not true, that kind of thing. More easily break it down and check specific things that we want. Basically, we want certain things to happen at certain times and certain things to happen not at specific situations. Hopefully some of that was made sense, and I hope to continue this, making some progress like this on in the next one, where I will probably actually, since we are now in the dungeon, or we know what dungeons to check out for, we will actually try to find all of the loot piles in said dungeon that have been generated in that dungeon, and then make a list of all those, and then loop through that list, and then check basically which ones to replace or do something with, and have an actual practical thing there, essentially. But long video out of the way, a lot of rambling out of the way. Thank you for watching this, and I will hope to see you in the next one.